Welcome to my channel. In this video we're gonna have a breakdown of this animation scene that I made in Blender. We're gonna go through the materials, textures and animation techniques used in this video, and you can apply these techniques into your characters and assets. And so the assets used in this scene include a path or a road, a car or any other automobile that you can use, a mesh that can be used to create these impact lines, and finally a smoke effect that can be used as an emission of the car. First we're gonna look at this road texture and the animation driven by this material. Let's start by deleting the lights and camera. With the default cube we can go to the shading tab. Take the default cube, scale it to make a road-like shape. Name your material and add a Voronoi texture. Press Ctrl T to add a mapping and texture coordinates. Connect the object information to the vector input of the mapping node. Apply the scale of the cube and in the Voronoi texture increase the scale to 20 or more. Change the F1 into distance to edge. Now connect this distance output to the height input of the bump node and connect the normal to the normal. I'm gonna invert the bumps and lower the strength. Now from a fair distance it looks like a road texture. Now we're gonna duplicate this mapping node and take the UV information of the texture coordinates. You can also use the object information, but the values will be different and the UVs are also easy to animate. Add a noise texture and connect it to the mapping node. Add another noise texture and mix these two textures with the mix node. Now for the bottom noise we have a scale of 10 and for the upper noise we have a scale of 6. The detail is 15 for both. Now add a color ramp after the mix node. In the mapping node, take the Y scale to 0. Add another mapping node and connect it to the second noise texture. In the mapping node, change the Y scale value to 1 and the X scale value to about 2.5 or 3. In the color ramp, choose constant mode and add another slider to it. In the middle slider, choose the color to that of the road, and in here the road is dark blue. The X scale value of the mapping node determines the number of these lines. Now the colors in these other sliders are the colors of these motion lines. Connect this color ramp to the base color input of the principal BSDF. So the second mapping node is the controller. You can change the size by changing the Y scale, number by the X scale, and you can animate this effect by keyframing the location input. I've added a value node connected to the location input and then added a hashtag frame divided by 70. Changing the division number can change the speed of animation. If you divide by a higher number, the animation will be slower, and if you divide by a smaller number, the animation will be faster. Also, the roughness should be 100%. Now let's have a final look of the whole texture. In the hover bike animation clip, I changed the color to some more vibrant colors and plugged the color ramp to the emission input as well. If you don't want this texture on the bottom here, the easiest way you can do is to add a loop cut closer to the upper surface and add another slot and material and assign the material to these slots, to these bottom faces. Now for the impact lines, we're going to create a NURBS curve path and increase the depth to about 3 or 4 meters. Create another material, delete the principal BSDF. Create an emission shader. Now add a transparent PSDF and mix these two with a mix shader node. Give a color to the emission node. Now we need a noise texture. Press Ctrl T to add a mapping and texture coordinates. Connect the object information to the vector input of the mapping node. Now add a separate XYZ node between the mapping and the noise texture and connect it to the Z socket and connect the Z socket to the noise. Add a color ramp after the noise and adjust the sliders and connect it to the factor input of the mix shader. In the material properties, change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. You can adjust the color ramp to change the thickness of these lines. Increase the emission strength to 5 and in the render settings turn on bloom. In order to move these lines, we need to change the location on the mapping node. So I'll add a value node connected to the location input of the mapping node. Now in this value node, type hashtag frame divided by a number, let's say 70 or 80. Now add a gradient texture and similarly connect the mapping node. Also a separate XYZ node between the mapping and the gradient node, and a math node after the gradient. Change the math operation to subtract. Now connect the output value of the subtract into the factor input of the mix shader, the lower value input into the gradient and the upper value input to the color ramp of the noise texture. Change the gradients mode to easing for more gradual effect. You can also add a color ramp after the gradients to have more control. Add an empty object, move it to the start of the mesh. In the texture coordinates, choose this empty in the object slot. Now when we move the empty, the texture should move but it's not moving. I'm going to apply the transforms of this mesh. The fact shows up but it's following the empty in the X coordinates. So in the material, we need to change the separate XYZ node and take the Y input into the gradient. Now the effect follows the empty in the Y direction. This color ramp can tweak the endpoint of these lines. So if you want a sharp edge here, you can do this by increasing the contrast of this color ramp. And this emission color determines the color of these lines. You can choose any color you want. So the overall material has a noise texture and a gradient texture. The noise has a Z coordinate of the separate XYZ node, and the gradient has a Y coordinate of the separate XYZ node. The two mapping nodes have the object information from the texture coordinates, while we have an empty to control these coordinates. There is a value node driving the location input of the mapping node that maps the noise texture. Both these textures have color ramps for further tweaking the value. The results of these two are then subtracted from each other and the end result is this, which controls the transparency and the emission. Now I have added a car model that I'll be using. Just move this car into position. You can use any car model. There are plenty of free stuff online on websites like Sketchfab and TurboSquid. For the emission smoke, I'm going to use a path curve, rotate by 90 degrees to align with the y-axis. Also move it to the place near the opening of the exhaust pipes. In the curve parameters, increase the depth. Hold Alt plus S to scale the individual points. Make a shape like this and then go to object and convert it into a mesh. Add a subdivision surface modifier and then a displace modifier. Add a new texture and go to the texture properties and choose Stucci or Stucci or whatever the pronunciation is. Now go to edit mode, press A to select all, and in the object data properties add a vertex group. Change the weight to 0.1 and assign. Now go to the weight painting mode and select the gradient tool and make a gradual weight from one corner to the other. Now add this vertex group in the displace modifier. Now add another empty object and in the displace modifier change the coordinates from local to object and choose this empty as the object. Now the scale, location and rotation coordinates of the displace modifier will be controlled by this empty. Duplicate this mesh for the other side as well. Now to animate, add a location keyframe, then at frame 100, move this empty and then add another location keyframe. Make the interpolation mode as linear. Create a new material, add a wave texture and press Ctrl T to add mapping and texture coordinates. Connect the object information to the vector input of the mapping node. Change the waves from bands to rings and apply the rotation and scale on both of these meshes. Now add a color ramp after the wave texture and connect into alpha input of the principal BSDF. Adjust the sliders of color ramp and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend to see the effect of the alpha input. Now plug the same color ramp output into the base color and emission inputs of the principal BSDF and change the white color of the color ramp. Phase offset value can be used to animate the effect. These are the values that I'll be using for the wave texture node. You can also duplicate this mesh and copy the material here and change the color of the emission to make duplicate impact lines, to make multiple impact lines. In one scene, I used a Voronoi texture for the emission and base color. Now you just need a camera and your lighting setup.